Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to talk briefly about the French and Indian War. The book that we use calls it the 7 Years' War. So it's typically called the 7 Years' War in Europe, and in the United States we refer to it as the French and Indian War, primarily because it was the British and the colonists fighting against the French and the Indians and their Indian allies. So we got to understand about the French and Indian War is that this is a truly world war. This is kind of the first one. The War of 1812 really is, but this is one of the big ones because pretty much everywhere you're fighting, so everywhere in red on this map, is actively engaged in combat. So you see, anywhere there's British and French colonies, they're at war with each other. So this is a world war, kind of our first big one. Now, most of the fighting starts right around here at Fort Duquesne. So you can see circling it right there. So Washington had gone out early to seize the fort. That goes poorly. He gets pushed back. We send another general, Braddock, out. It goes poorly again, and this escalates into a full-fledged war. So what starts in the colonies turns into a world war that pulls two entire empires into combat. So Fort Duquesne. So that's roughly what Fort Duquesne would look like. I know it looks like Fort Duquesne, but it's French. So Fort Duquesne. So this is the fort that Washington was sent out to take. It was a French fort, and the British wanted the French out to get access to trading rights with the Native Americans, particularly pelts, so beaver, fur pelts, and stuff like that. So George Washington, this is roughly what it would look like during the French and Indian War. Now, his expedition out did not go well. He was forced to retreat and was left with the only option. He could not run the French, so he had to build a fort called Fort Necessity. So it's not a very great fort. It's at the base of a hill. And if you notice on this little diorama image, very few people are inside the fort. Most of the people are outside the fort. Not exactly the ideal layout for a fort. So it goes poorly. Washington gets captured and he'll be ransomed back, traded back later on. But this early experience of Washington, not so great. So the British aren't willing to give up. So like I said, they send Braddock out. So General Braddock leads an expedition out, and he's very cocky and arrogant. He thinks, oh, no one can beat the British. So he actually talks a lot of trash to his Indian guides. So the people who actually know the land, they abandon him, and he keeps marching out, and they're dragging heavy cannons through the forest. They have a whole team of woodcutters cutting down trees, build roads and passes. So the guys doing the cutting are what are called pioneer sergeants. They're the only rank in the British military that's allowed to have a beard. So their beard was designed to kind of give them protection, particularly for blacksmithing. Now, this is roughly what a pioneer sergeant would look like at this point in time during the French and Indian War, and this is what a pioneer sergeant looks like today in the British Army. So we got to understand it's not just men marching out. You also have women called camp followers. Sometimes these are cooks, sometimes they clean and wash clothes. You also have prostitutes following. So you have a lot of different women with the army. While they're not soldiers, they're not fighting, you got to understand women are present. If there's an army moving, there's almost always a group of women following them. Sometimes their husband, and sometimes their wives to officers, sometimes there's wives to soldiers, all these kinds of things. Sometimes, it's less reputable. But nonetheless, you almost always have women in these armies. So General Braddock marches out. He's cocky, he's arrogant, and it goes poorly. This turns into Braddock's defeat. So he gets caught off guard by the French and the Native Americans. Braddock wants to fight a traditional battle where you stand in line, takes turns shooting at each other. This goes poorly. Native Americans hide behind trees. So do the French. They have protection and they decimate the British. So Braddock ends up getting killed, and Washington, who Braddock had brought with him as kind of a guide, gets captured again. So Washington, not doing well. He's going to be the hero of the American Revolution, but he's not that man yet. So the war keeps going, and it's not going great for the British. The next big battle is the Battle of Fort William Henry. This is a British fort. The French have been attacking British colonies and colonists and their farms. So these colonists fled to Fort William Henry for protection. They get surrounded and they're going to be outnumbered by the French. So the British commander at Fort William Henry decides, okay, it's time to surrender. So they surrender with the promise from the French that they will be able to, surrender the fort, and the British troops and the civilians, the British colonists, can leave and go back to the main British colonies. However, the Native American allies of the French disagreed with this. Typically in these battles, the Native Americans got to keep what they killed. So if they killed someone, they got to keep his gun, his supplies, all this kinds of stuff. So part of what basically purchased Indian support was rewards, the booty after victory. Problem was, no victory, no battle, it was solved politically, so therefore there was no spoils of war. Well, the Native Americans weren't happy about this, so they attack, they capture a bunch of these colonists and soldiers, they scalp dozens of these men. If you know what scalping is, they take a knife, put it against the base of the skull, and just scrape it all the way back and basically pull you by the hair and scrape your skin off so they have like a little pelt, a human pelt, and it's kind of a trophy. So people get kidnapped, several, dozen get killed, dozen more get scalped, and this goes really poorly. And this is going to cause outrage back in the colonies and in England. And this is where things begin to change. The British Empire says, okay, we can't let this stand. A new leader of England rises, a new head of Parliament, Lord William Pitt, and he's going to appoint Geoffrey Amherst as a new general, kind of the overall commanding general. So a couple things are going to change. We're going to take the fight to the French, so push into Canada. In order to do that, we're going to target Louisbourg up here, this little island off the tip of Nova Scotia. Now, Louisbourg is kind of the main entry port into the St. Lawrence River. So the British figure, if they can capture this port, isolate it, they can block off any French supplies going to Quebec and Montreal. They successfully take Louisbourg, and they begin a two-front assault. So coming up into the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the St. Lawrence River, targeting Quebec, and then Amherst himself is going to lead another assault on Montreal. Now, as kind of a thumbing of the nose to the French, we send another general out to capture Fort Duquesne. Now, we didn't need Fort Duquesne. It wasn't a valuable place for the course of the war, but we had been defeated twice there, so the British want to send another army out to be sure to send the message, you might defeat us, but we'll win in the end. So, the two campaigns are going, the marching has begun, and the British arrive outside of Quebec. So you have the British General Wolfe against the French General Montcalm. Now it's hard for the British to attack because Quebec's kind of placed at the junction of this river, but also up on cliffs. You can kind of see in this thing, there's very steep cliffs. But the British find a small path that allows them to come up behind onto what are known as the Plains of Abraham. So the French decide to march out and meet the British army on the field. And this turns into a bloody show, a horrible battle. Both major generals on each side die in the battle, but the British manage to win and capture Quebec. And by the time Amherst, a year later, arrives at Montreal, Montreal is completely isolated. So Montreal is going to be forced to surrender because there's no help coming from Quebec because they're captured. So Montreal surrenders, pretty much ending the war in the colonies. It'll fight for a little bit longer in Europe, but in the American colonies, the war is pretty much over. So there'll be some fighting elsewhere. So back in Europe, along some of the other colonies, but in the Americas, or in the North American colonies, it's pretty much over. So let's look at some of the political results. So you have the Treaty of Paris, 1763. Now be careful what Treaty of Paris is. We have several of those, so make sure you know the date because it might get you mixed up. So everything in red is what the British had before the war. Everything in pink is what they gained. So they gained a whole lot of land. And when the colonists see all of this land, they're like, oh yeah, we can go settle that. But this was supposed to be designated to Native Americans, and this is going to cause a bit of a problem. So some of the social results. So you get Pontiac's Rebellion, the rebellion of those Indians that lived in that Native American reserve because the colonists were moving in. They revolt and start a war almost immediately with the British. So the British weren't happy about having to fight a war just after finishing one. The colonists weren't happy because they weren't getting the land, and everything seems to be going to crap. So what the British do is create a boundary line called the Proclamation Line. They draw basically this proclamation line along the Appalachian Mountains, saying, colonists, you stay on this side, on the east side. Native Americans, you stay on the west side. Don't bump into each other, don't cross this line, you'll all be good. Problem was, the colonists didn't really listen. So some of the economic results. So the British national debt will double as a result of the French and Indian War. Now, if their debt goes up, who's going to pay off that debt? How does the country pay that off? Taxes. Who started the war? The colonists. So they assume the colonists are going to pay a heavier burden. Now keep in mind, the colonists have been paying very light taxes for a very long time. So all the British want to do is raise taxes up to the same level as what British citizens in England and Scotland already pay. So basically just leveling the playing field, not raising unfair taxes, but just restoring a balance in taxes between the colonies and the mother country. The colonists didn't quite see it that way. Things like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and different things like that are going to cause a backlash in the American colonies that will eventually escalate into war and the American Revolution. I'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up next time.